The Phantom Economy: How a Bankrupt Nation Built the World's Most Powerful War Machine. When Adolf Hitler seized power in January 1933, Germany was not merely struggling economically, it was a nation on the brink of total collapse. The Treaty of Versailles had shackled the country with 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an astronomical sum designed to ensure Germany could never threaten Europe again. Unemployment had reached catastrophic levels, hovering near 30%. 6 million Germans wandered the streets without work, without hope, their savings obliterated by the hyperinflation of 1923 that had turned life savings into worthless paper. The Weimar Republic's treasury was empty. International credit had dried up. By every conventional economic measure, Germany was finished, a broken state with no resources, no gold reserves, and no apparent path to recovery, let alone rearmament. Yet within 6 years, this supposedly bankrupt nation would field the most technologically advanced and largest military force Europe had ever seen. By 1939, the Wehrmacht consisted of over 3.7 million soldiers, equipped with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The Kriegsmarine was expanding rapidly. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Germany had not only recovered, it had become an industrial juggernaut capable of sustaining a two-front war that would consume the entire continent. This transformation defies every principle of orthodox economics. A nation cannot simply conjure an army from nothing. Weapons require steel. Steel requires coal and iron ore. Soldiers need uniforms, boots, rations, and training facilities. The infrastructure alone, the barracks, airfields, tank factories, and munitions plants, represents an investment of staggering proportions. So how did Hitler do it? How does a bankrupt state with no gold, no credit, and no international support finance the largest military expansion in modern history? The answer is not found in any economics textbook. It lies instead in one of history's most audacious and sinister financial experiments, a shadow economy built on deception, coercion, and mechanisms so unorthodox that even today economists struggle to fully comprehend their implications. Hitler did not rebuild Germany's economy. He created an entirely parallel system, one that existed beneath the surface of normal financial operations, invisible to international observers, and designed with a single purpose: total war. At the heart of the system was a man whose name remains relatively unknown outside academic circles, yet whose innovations would prove as consequential as any general's battlefield strategy. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and minister of economics from 1934 to 1937, was a financial magician, a master of monetary manipulation who understood that in the absence of real wealth, one could create the illusion of wealth so convincing that it functioned as reality itself. Schacht was no Nazi ideologue. He was a pragmatist, a technocrat who saw in Hitler's regime an opportunity to implement radical economic theories that no democratic government would ever permit. His relationship with the Führer was transactional. Hitler needed someone who could finance rearmament without triggering international alarm or domestic inflation. Schacht needed absolute authority to overturn every principle of sound fiscal policy. The foundation of Schacht's system was a simple but revolutionary realization. Germany didn't need real money. It needed the appearance of money. It needed a mechanism to mobilize labor and resources without the constraints of actual currency. Traditional economics teaches that governments finance spending through 3 methods: taxation, borrowing, or printing money. But taxation requires a functioning economy with taxable income. Borrowing requires creditors willing to lend. Printing money causes inflation, which would destroy public confidence and potentially spark the kind of social unrest that had toppled the Weimar Republic. Schacht rejected all 3 orthodox approaches. Instead, he invented something entirely new: a system of phantom financing that would allow the Nazi state to spend money it didn't have on a scale the world had never imagined possible. The instrument of this deception was called the MEFO Bill, short for Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Metallurgical Research Corporation. On paper, MEFO was a private company, jointly owned by Germany's largest industrial firms, Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. In reality, it was a shell corporation, a ghost entity created solely to issue a new form of currency that existed outside the normal banking system and beyond the scrutiny of international observers. Here's how the mechanism worked and why it was so devastatingly effective. When the German government wanted to purchase weapons, vehicles, or raw materials for rearmament, it didn't pay companies directly in Reichsmarks. Instead, it paid them in MEFO bills, promissory notes issued by this private company, guaranteed by the state and accepted by the Reichsbank as collateral for loans.
Companies receiving these bills could either hold them until maturity, earning 4% interest, or discount them immediately at any German bank for cash. The genius and the evil of the system was its invisibility. MEFO bills didn't appear in the government's budget. They weren't counted as public debt. They didn't increase the money supply in any measurable way because they circulated primarily among corporations and banks, never reaching the general population. To international observers, Germany's fiscal position appeared relatively stable. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly prohibited German rearmament, and the Allied powers were watching for any sign of military expansion. Yet the MEFO system allowed Hitler to pour billions of Reichsmarks into weapons production while maintaining the fiction of compliance. Between 1934 and 1936, the Nazi state issued over 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO bills, an absolutely staggering sum, equivalent to roughly 50% of Germany's entire GDP in 1933. This was not an economy recovering. This was an economy being completely restructured for war, financed by instruments that technically didn't exist.
The architecture of theft, plunder, coercion, and the machinery of extraction. But MEFO bills alone could not sustain the scale of Hitler's ambitions. By 1936, the system was beginning to show cracks. The bills were coming due, and the Reichsbank would eventually have to convert them into actual currency, a reckoning that threatened to expose the entire charade. Schacht himself grew increasingly alarmed at the pace of military spending, warning Hitler that the economy was overheating and that continued expansion without real resources would lead to catastrophic inflation or outright collapse. The Führer's response was characteristically ruthless. He didn't slow down rearmament. He simply found new sources of funding, sources that required no repayment, no interest, and no accountability. He turned to theft. The Nazi economic model was not capitalism in any recognizable form, nor was it true socialism despite the party's name. It was something far more sinister, a system of institutionalized plunder where the state extracted wealth from targeted populations through mechanisms both legal and brutal. The first victims were Germany's Jews. The process began gradually, almost invisibly, with bureaucratic measures that seemed merely discriminatory rather than economically catastrophic. Jewish professionals were barred from civil service positions in 1933. Jewish businesses were subjected to boycotts. Jewish property was devalued through social pressure and legal restrictions. But by 1938, the mask had come off entirely, and the regime's intentions became horrifyingly clear. The November pogroms of 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, marked a turning point not just in the persecution of Jews, but in the economic strategy of the Nazi state. The violence was not spontaneous, despite propaganda claims to the contrary. It was coordinated, systematic, and followed immediately by a series of decrees that revealed its true purpose. Jewish business owners were forced to repair the damage at their own expense. Then came the atonement tax, 1 billion Reichsmarks extracted from the Jewish community as collective punishment for an assassination carried out by a single individual in Paris. Jewish businesses were forcibly Aryanized, transferred to German ownership at a fraction of their actual value, or simply confiscated outright. Jewish families were compelled to surrender jewelry, art, securities, and foreign currency. Insurance payments for destroyed property were seized by the state. This was not merely persecution. It was economic warfare waged against German citizens, a deliberate program of wealth extraction designed to fund the military machine. Conservative estimates suggest the Nazi regime stole between 8 and 10 billion Reichsmarks from German Jews between 1933 and 1939, a sum nearly equivalent to the entire MEFO bill program. And this was only the beginning. As Germany expanded through annexation and conquest, the machinery of theft expanded with it. When Austria was absorbed into the Reich in March 1938, the Nazis didn't just gain territory, they seized the Austrian National Bank's gold reserves, approximately 1.4 billion Reichsmarks worth, and immediately transferred them to Berlin. Austrian Jews, numbering nearly 200,000, were subjected to even more aggressive appropriation than their German counterparts. Adolf Eichmann perfected his techniques in Vienna, creating assembly line processes for stripping families of their wealth before forcing them into exile or concentration camps. The annexation of the Sudetenland in September 1938, followed by the complete occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, brought even greater windfalls. Czechoslovakia was an industrial powerhouse, home to the Skoda Works, one of Europe's premier armaments manufacturers. When German troops marched into Prague, they didn't just conquer a nation, they acquired an entire military-industrial complex, intact and fully operational. The Czech gold reserves, over 23 tons held in the Bank for International Settlements, were seized through a combination of political pressure and outright theft. Perhaps even more valuable were the weapon stockpiles, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and small arms that would equip entire Wehrmacht divisions. By some estimates, the Czech military equipment captured in 1939 was sufficient to outfit 40 divisions, more than the German army had possessed in 1933.
But the Nazi economic engine required more than golden weapons. It required labor, vast amounts of human effort to operate the factories, mines, and construction projects that war demanded. Here again, the regime turned to coercion. The introduction of compulsory labor service in 1935 gave the state the power to direct where and how Germans worked. Young men were funneled into the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, where they built roads, airfields, and military fortifications while receiving wages far below market rates. This was conscription by another name, millions of workers whose labor was commandeered by the state, generating infrastructure worth billions of Reichsmarks while avoiding the fiscal burden of paying fair wages. As war approached, even this wasn't enough. The regime began importing workers from countries under German influence or occupation. Austrian and Czech workers were recruited, a euphemism for forced relocation, to German factories. The pace would accelerate dramatically once the war began, but the systems were already in place by 1939. The entire economy had been restructured around extraction, extracting wealth from Jews and other persecuted groups, extracting resources from conquered territories, extracting labor from populations that had no choice but to comply. Every mechanism was designed to funnel resources toward a single objective: military power. Yet even as these revenue streams converged, the Nazi state faced a fundamental problem that no amount of theft could solve: raw materials. Germany lacked the natural resources necessary for sustained industrial warfare. It had limited oil reserves, insufficient rubber production, inadequate supplies of copper, nickel, and other strategic metals. A modern military requires rubber for tires, oil for fuel, copper for electrical wiring and ammunition casings, chromium for armor plating. Germany had to import nearly all of these materials, but imports require foreign currency, and Germany's foreign exchange reserves were essentially non-existent. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped away colonies that might have provided resources. International sanctions limited trade options. How does a nation wage war when it cannot access the materials war requires? The Nazi answer was a system of bilateral trade agreements designed to circumvent normal currency markets entirely. Schacht pioneered this approach, negotiating deals with countries in Eastern Europe and South America where Germany would exchange manufactured goods for raw materials without any actual money changing hands. Yugoslavia would ship iron ore to Germany and receive German machinery in return, the values balanced through complex accounting that avoided the need for foreign currency. Romania provided oil. Hungary supplied bauxite for aluminum production. These agreements were structured to create dependency. Partner nations became economically tied to Germany, unable to easily shift to other trading partners because the arrangements were so deeply integrated into their own economic planning.
The synthetic solution: autarky, innovation, and the gamble on ersatz. But bilateral trade, however cleverly structured, could never provide everything the Nazi war machine required. The volumes were insufficient, the supply chains vulnerable to political shifts, and the dependence on foreign nations, however subordinate, remained a strategic liability Hitler found intolerable. The Führer's vision demanded something more radical: complete economic self-sufficiency, or autarky. Germany would produce everything it needed within its own borders, breaking free from international markets entirely. This was not merely an economic policy, it was an ideological imperative, rooted in Nazi beliefs about racial superiority and territorial destiny. A master race, in Hitler's view, should not depend on lesser nations for survival. The problem was that autarky defied basic geology. You cannot simply will oil fields into existence. Rubber trees do not grow in Bavaria. Germany's coal reserves were substantial, but converting coal into the fuels and materials modern warfare demanded required technologies that barely existed. What followed was one of the most ambitious and desperate scientific industrial programs in history: the development of ersatz, synthetic substitutes for materials Germany could not access naturally. This program would consume enormous resources, employ thousands of scientists and engineers, and produce results both remarkable and ultimately insufficient. The centerpiece of the ersatz economy was synthetic fuel production. Germany's oil reserves were negligible, perhaps enough to sustain the military for a few weeks of intensive operations. Without imported oil, the tanks would stop, the aircraft would be grounded, and the navy would rust at anchor. The Bergius process and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis offered a potential solution, converting coal into liquid fuels through complex chemical reactions. Germany had coal in abundance. If that coal could be transformed into gasoline and diesel, the oil dependency could be broken. Hitler embraced this technology with fanatical enthusiasm, pouring billions of Reichsmarks into constructing massive hydrogenation plants across Germany. By 1939, these facilities were producing approximately 72 million barrels of synthetic fuel annually, a substantial achievement that represented nearly half of Germany's total oil consumption. But the costs were staggering. Synthetic fuel was roughly 4 times more expensive to produce than imported petroleum. The plants required enormous amounts of coal, water, and electricity. They were massive, immobile industrial complexes, vulnerable to bombing and dependent on continuous resource inputs. Moreover, the fuel quality was inferior to natural petroleum, causing engine problems and requiring constant technical adjustments. The entire program was a testament to German engineering capability, yet it also revealed the fundamental impossibility of the Nazi project.
You can synthesize oil from coal, but you cannot make the economics work. Germany was spending vast sums to produce an inferior product at unsustainable cost, all to maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency. The same dynamic played out across other critical materials. Rubber presented another seemingly insurmountable challenge. Natural rubber comes from tropical plantations, primarily in Southeast Asia, regions far beyond Nazi control in the 1930s. Yet rubber was absolutely essential for tires, gaskets, hoses, insulation, and countless other military applications. The German chemical industry, led by IG Farben, developed Buna, synthetic rubber produced from coal, limestone, and petroleum. It was another remarkable scientific achievement, and by 1939, Germany was producing approximately 22,000 tons of Buna annually. But again, the synthetic substitute was inferior to natural rubber. It was less elastic, less durable, and far more expensive. German pilots would later complain that Buna tires wore out at twice the rate of natural rubber, a seemingly minor issue that translated into logistical nightmares when multiplied across millions of vehicles. Beyond fuel and rubber, the Nazi regime invested heavily in developing synthetic textiles, artificial fertilizers to compensate for limited agricultural productivity, and even ersatz foods, coffee substitutes made from roasted grain, honey made from saccharin and water, butter replaced with margarine produced from coal derivatives. The population was being asked to accept a steadily declining quality of life, all while being told that Germany was becoming stronger and more independent. The propaganda machine worked overtime to present these substitutions as victories rather than compromises, framing sacrifice as patriotic duty and deprivation as preparation for greatness. The economic architecture supporting all of this was overseen by Hermann Göring, who became plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan in 1936. Schacht, increasingly alarmed by the regime's recklessness and its rejection of economic reality, was being sidelined. Göring had no such scruples. His mandate was simple: prepare Germany for war within 4 years, regardless of cost or consequence. The Four-Year Plan marked the moment when Nazi economic policy abandoned even the pretense of sustainability. Göring created vast state-owned industrial conglomerates. The Reichsmarks Hermann Göring became one of Europe's largest steel and mining operations, built entirely through state direction and employing hundreds of thousands of workers. These enterprises operate outside normal market mechanisms. They didn't need to turn a profit, they didn't need to compete. They existed solely to produce materials for rearmament, their losses absorbed by a state that had long since stopped caring about conventional accounting. The regime also manipulated currency controls with increasing aggression. Germans were forbidden from holding foreign currency without authorization. Capital flight was criminalized. Wages were frozen to prevent inflation, even as consumer goods became scarce. Rationing began before the war even started. Restrictions on meats, fats, and other staples implemented in 1939 under the guise of ensuring adequate supplies for the military. The population was being squeezed from every direction, their wages suppressed, their savings devalued through hidden inflation, their consumption restricted, their labor increasingly directed by state mandate rather than personal choice. And still, it wasn't enough. By 1939, Germany's foreign exchange reserves were virtually exhausted. The MEFO Bills had largely been retired, but only by issuing different forms of government debt that were equally unsustainable. The Treasury was running massive deficits. The exact figures were state secrets, but estimates suggest the regime was spending nearly 60% of GDP on military-related expenses, a proportion that would bankrupt any normal nation within months. Göring's four-year plan had failed to achieve true autarky. Germany remained dependent on imports for critical materials, but lacked the currency to pay for them. The entire economic structure was a house of cards, held together by coercion, deception, and the expectation that war would solve the fiscal crisis by providing access to the resources of conquered nations. This was the terrible logic that made war inevitable. The Nazi economy was not building toward war as one policy option among many. It was structured in a way that made war the only option. The debts could never be repaid, the promises could never be kept, the synthetic substitutes could never replace actual resources. The only way forward was conquest, seizing the oil fields of Romania and eventually the Caucasus, capturing the agricultural production of Ukraine, looting the industrial capacity of Western Europe, and extracting labor and wealth from occupied populations on a scale that would make the pre-war theft from German Jews seem almost modest by comparison. Hitler understood this perfectly. In private discussions with military leaders, he was explicit. Germany must strike soon, before the economic contradictions became apparent, before the illusion collapsed. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was not just a military decision, it was an economic necessity, the moment when the Nazi regime stopped pretending it could sustain itself and began openly gambling that conquest would provide what deception could no longer deliver.
The Ponzi scheme of blood, war as economic policy, and the collapse of illusion. When German forces crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, they were not merely launching a military campaign, they were executing a financial strategy. The invasion was the logical endpoint of an economic system that had been designed, from its inception, to consume more than it could produce. Every mechanism Hitler had employed to finance rearmament, the phantom currency of MEFO Bills, the systematic plunder of Jewish wealth, the forced extraction of resources from annexed territories, the unsustainable production of synthetic materials, had been temporary measures, buying time until conquest could provide what Germany lacked. The Nazi economy was, in essence, a Ponzi scheme. It could only sustain itself by constantly acquiring new sources of wealth from outside the system. And like all Ponzi schemes, it required exponential growth to avoid collapse. Each conquest had to be larger than the last, each campaign more ambitious, until the mathematical impossibility of infinite expansion brought the entire structure crashing down. Poland provided immediate returns. The invasion netted Germany significant industrial capacity, particularly in Silesia, along with agricultural resources and a captive labor force of millions. But the costs were also immediate and severe. The Wehrmacht's rapid victory masked the fact that ammunition expenditures had been enormous. Artillery shells, bombs, and fuel consumed at rates that shocked even German military planners. Stockpiles that were supposed to last months were depleted in weeks. The invasion proved both the power of the military machine Hitler had built and its voracious appetite for resources. More importantly, it demonstrated that Germany could not sustain offensive operations for extended periods without access to resources far beyond what it currently controlled. The conquest of Western Europe in 1940 brought far greater prizes. The defeat of France was not just a military humiliation for the Allies, it was an economic catastrophe that transferred staggering wealth into Nazi hands. French gold reserves, industrial equipment, railway stock, and raw materials were systematically stripped and sent to Germany. The occupation regime imposed punitive financial terms. France was forced to pay occupation costs of 400 million francs per day, a sum deliberately calculated to exceed the actual expenses of maintaining German forces. The excess was pure extraction, a tribute system disguised as administrative necessity. The exchange rate was fixed at artificially favorable terms for Germany, allowing the occupiers to purchase French goods with marks that were essentially worthless outside the Reich. French factories were subordinated to German production schedules, manufacturing goods for the Wehrmacht while French civilians faced increasing shortages. The Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, each conquered nation became a tributary state, its economy restructured to serve German needs. Millions of workers were eventually deported to Germany as forced laborers, replacing German men who had been conscripted into military service. By 1944, foreign workers and prisoners of war would constitute more than 20% of Germany's labor force, approximately 7.6 million people working under conditions ranging from harsh exploitation to outright slavery. This was the labor force that had been missing in 1933, the resource that no amount of financial engineering could create. War provided it through the simplest means possible, kidnapping human beings and forcing them to work at gunpoint. Yet even these vast influxes of wealth and labor could not make the system sustainable. The German economy during the war years was characterized by chronic inefficiency, bureaucratic chaos, and the fundamental contradiction between Nazi ideology and industrial rationality. Hitler's regime was never a streamlined dictatorship with clear chains of command. It was a tangle of competing power centers, rival ministries, overlapping jurisdictions, regional party bosses, and military commanders all vying for the Führer's favor, all pursuing contradictory objectives. Göring's economic empire competed with Albert Speer's armaments ministry. The SS developed its own industrial operations, including the exploitation of concentration camp labor. The military services fought among themselves for resources, with the Luftwaffe, Army, and Navy each demanding priority for their programs. This organizational nightmare meant that Germany never achieved the kind of total industrial mobilization that Britain and the Soviet Union managed. Luxury goods continued to be produced well into the war because Nazi leaders feared that imposing genuine austerity on the German population might provoke unrest. The regime remembered the collapse of 1918, when war weariness and starvation on the home front had led to revolution. Hitler was determined not to repeat that mistake, even if it meant fighting a world war without fully mobilizing his economy. German factories operated single shifts in industries where triple shifts were technically feasible. Women were not systematically mobilized into the workforce as they were in Britain and America, because Nazi ideology insisted that women belonged in the home. These were not minor inefficiencies, they were strategic handicaps, self-imposed limitations rooted in the contradictions of Nazi ideology. Moreover, the territories Germany conquered proved far less valuable than anticipated. Occupying nations is expensive. It requires troops for garrison duty, administrators to run the occupation bureaucracy, and constant security operations against resistance movements. The resources extracted had to be balanced against the costs of extraction. In the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht discovered that simply destroying infrastructure during the advance made it nearly impossible to exploit resources during occupation. Scorched earth tactics by retreating Soviet forces left oil fields burning and factories demolished. Even when facilities were captured intact, getting them operational again required technical expertise, spare parts, and transportation networks that had been shattered by combat. The mineral wealth of the Donbass region, the agricultural production of Ukraine,
These assets existed on paper, but could never be fully realized because war itself made efficient exploitation impossible. The most damning evidence of the Nazi economic system's failure came in the realm of strategic production. Despite controlling most of continental Europe by 1942, Germany was being outproduced by the Allies across virtually every category. Soviet factories, evacuated to the Urals and Siberia, were churning out tanks and artillery at rates German industry couldn't match. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, was simply overwhelming, producing more aircraft in a year than Germany had built in the entire pre-war period. Britain, blockaded and bombed, nevertheless maintained production levels that defy German expectations. The reason was straightforward. The Allied economies, for all their own problems, were operating according to rational economic principles. Resources were allocated based on efficiency. Production was optimized through standardization. Labor was organized systematically rather than through slave camps and coercion. Germany's economy, by contrast, remained fundamentally irrational. It was an economy built on lies. Lies about solvency, lies about sustainability, lies about racial superiority translating into industrial prowess. The vaunted German engineering excellence existed, but it was hampered by a system that prioritized ideological purity over competence, that murdered or expelled many of its best scientists because they were Jewish, that wasted vast resources on prestige projects and superweapons that offered no strategic value. The V-2 rocket program consumed resources equivalent to producing thousands of conventional fighters, yet delivered almost no military benefit. But it appealed to Nazi fantasies of technological dominance, and in Hitler's Germany, fantasy often trumped reality. By 1943, the illusion was crumbling. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the end of German offensive capabilities in the East. Allied bombing campaigns were steadily destroying the synthetic fuel plants and transportation infrastructure that the entire system depended upon. The Romanian oil fields essential to German operations came under increasing threat. Goering's four-year plan had not achieved autarky. Germany remained desperately dependent on resources it could not protect. Speer managed to increase armaments production through extreme rationalization and brutal exploitation of forced labor, but he was simply squeezing the last productivity from a system that had long since exhausted its foundation. The final accounting of Hitler's economic miracle revealed it was never a miracle at all. It was theft on an industrial scale, temporary measures presented as permanent solutions, and a willingness to mortgage the future against conquests that might never come. The 6 million unemployed Germans who found work after 1933 were employed building weapons for wars of aggression. The Autobahns were military infrastructure disguised as public works. The apparent prosperity was built on plundered Jewish wealth, coerced labor, and accounting fraud. And when the system could no longer sustain its own contradictions, when the conquered territories proved insufficient and the Allied economies proved stronger, the entire structure collapsed with a totality that matched its initial ambitions.